One of the worst war crimes in history saw hundreds of thousands of civilians slaughtered inside and around the city of Nanking. The city was put to the sword heavily in 1937 by the Japanese army, who committed scores of atrocities and crimes against the people of the city. There was extensive looting and torture, as well as arson conducted, but there were thousands executed on the banks of the river, and there were massacres absolutely everywhere. There were war crimes committed on the march even towards Nanking, and 2 Japanese officers even had a sadistic competition to see who could execute 100 people the quickest using a sword. The reality of this sick sport was that women and children were ran through with the swords of the officers, not enemy combatants. One former Japanese soldier claimed, "We'd take all the men behind the house and kill them with bayonets and knives. Then we'd lock up the women and children in a single house and assault them at night. Then before we left the next morning, we'd kill all the women and children, and to top it off, we'd set fire to the houses, so that even if anyone came back, they wouldn't have a place to live." For the slaughter inside of Nanking, there were very few who were ever brought to justice for their actions and crimes and the command inside of the city at the end of the Second World War. But there were specifically 2 reprisal executions in the city in front of thousands of people who had suffered heavily during the battle. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The city of Nanking had strategic importance for the Japanese army, and by December 1937, the Japanese army had reached the outskirts of the city, and they then, during a ferocious and terrible battle, put the city to the sword. The Japanese rampaged throughout the city without much resistance, and captured Chinese soldiers who were executed immediately, as were many civilians who were falsely accused of being a Chinese soldier. Women and children were subjected to the same sort of behaviour. One person who saw the actions of the Japanese claimed, "The Japanese have looted widely yesterday and today, have destroyed schools, have killed civilians and assaulted women." 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers, whom the International Committee hoped to save, were taken from them, and by this time are probably shot or bayoneted. In our South Hill house, Japanese broke the panel of the storeroom and took out some old fruit juice and a few other things. A former Japanese soldier spoke about the chaos inside the city, and he said of his own forces, "When I tried to cut off the first one, either the farmer moved or I misaimed. I ended up slicing off just part of his skull," referring to an execution. "Blood spurted upwards, I swung again, and this time I killed him. We were taught that we were a superior race, since we lived only for the sake of a human god, our emperor. But the Chinese were not, so we held nothing but contempt for them. There were many assaults, and the women were always killed. When they were being assaulted, the women were human, but once this was finished, they became pig's flesh." It was pure horror, and those who saw the terror in the city were scarred by the terrible actions of the Japanese. A surgeon who worked in the university hospital in Nanking said, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages, telling of cases of assault and brutality almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. Let me recount some instances occurring in the last 2 days. Last night, the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were assaulted. 2 girls about 16 were killed in one refugee camp. In the university middle school, where there were around 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night over the wall, stole food, clothing, and assaulted until they were satisfied. They bayoneted one little boy of 8 who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that penetrated his stomach. A portion of omentum was outside the abdomen. I think he will live." The man who had been placed in control of the safety zone later stated, "I've written several times in this diary about the body of the Chinese soldier who was shot whilst tied to the bamboo bed and who is still lying unburied near my house. My protests and pleas to the Japanese embassy finally to get this corpse buried or give me permission to bury it have thus far been fruitless. The body is still lying in the same spot as before, except that the ropes have been cut and the bamboo bed is now lying about 2 yards away. I am totally puzzled by the conduct of the Japanese in this matter. On the one hand, they want to be recognised and treated as a great power, on par with European powers. On the other, they are currently displaying a crudity, brutality and bestiality that bears no comparison, except with the hordes of Genghis Khan. I have stopped trying to get the poor devil buried, but I hereby record that he, though very dead, still lies above the earth. These were just some accounts from the people living inside of Nanking when the Japanese arrived, but for all of the crimes inside of the city, there was little reprisal for the Chinese people after the end of the Second World War. The death toll on civilians is generally accepted to be roughly 200,000 people, but some estimates place it higher, and there were dozens of thousands more who were executed as prisoners of war, or who were subject to terrifying assault ordeals. There was little help given to the people inside of the city also, and following the surrender of Japan during the Second World War, the officers in charge of the Japanese soldiers at Nanking were placed on trial, if they survived. General Iwani Matsui, for example, was later executed in 1948 for his involvement, being hanged inside of the American-controlled Sugamo prison. Some were tried based on the command principle, and this was that they were responsible for their soldiers who committed crimes, but there were two specific reprisal executions of senior Japanese officers for their involvement in the Nanking crimes that occurred at Nanking. These men were both brought to the city and the region for their executions in front of crowds of thousands, and these people were the ones who had suffered greatly. General Hisao Tani had many forces under his command during the Nanking Massacre, and his men committed many crimes. Tani was an experienced military official, and he was the commander of groups of soldiers up until the end of the Second World War. Hiroshi Matsumoto was a Japanese war criminal who was nicknamed the Wolf of Jiashan. He was involved in the slaughter in the city of Nanking, and he killed many local people, and they referred to him specifically as the living king of hell. These two men were two of only a very select few who were actually brought back to Nanking to face the crowds of their crimes to be executed. On the 26th of April 1947, the very senior Tani was brought out in front of a huge crowd outside the south gate of Nanking to an execution spot at the foot of Mount Yuhuatai. There were thousands of people who were gathered to witness the execution, and he was to be executed by shooting. The people who had gathered there shouted curses at General Tani as he was helped onto a patch of wasteland, and there were soldiers stood with their weapons primed. He was not tied to a stake, but instead an executioner held his arms and then just shot him in the back of the head as he was kneeling down. It was a quick and ruthless execution in front of thousands. This is the same fate that Hiroshi Matsumoto had earlier faced on the 11th of June 1946. He was brought out in the same location, whilst thousands stood on a hill and watched. Matsumoto was stood with his arms behind his back, which on this occasion had been tied behind his back, and an executioner, who seemingly is wearing an exported German Stahlhelm, pulls out his pistol and fires into the back of Matsumoto's skull. Presumably this man was a victim of the Nanking crimes, and was either a member of the Chinese army or an inhabitant of the city. He was instantly killed by the Chinese executioner at point-blank range, and had also been blindfolded. For the horrors that were committed inside of Nanking, there was very little reprisal for the death and slaughter that the Japanese forces carried out in the city. The executions that took place on those days in front of the large crowds went only a small way as to offering some form of justice to those people who had survived. Of course, there were more senior Japanese commanders and members of the government who were executed, but these were not taken to China or Nanking to face their execution, and instead were hanged on the gallows in front of crowds of no one, controlled by the Americans in prisons. The executions that took place at the foot of the mountain offered the survivors of the city a glimpse of some form of justice. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.